Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning from Washington. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President for Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Delighted to welcome you to this event on next steps in U.S. Japan economic relations, an important topic that we don't spend enough time on here in Washington and really need to, because it's an important, they're an important set of issues. I will pull in a terrific group of experts in a second to discuss all of this. But first, let me just say two words of thanks. First, on this Veterans Day here in the U.S., I want to thank anyone who has served in the armed services. Thank you for your service. We're all very grateful for that. Secondly, I want to thank our sponsor, Merck Co. We can't do what we do without the support of our sponsors, and we really appreciate that. So thank you very much. Okay, this is a really important opportunity, I think, to look at U.S.-Japan economic relations, and it's timely. You've got a new prime minister in Japan who may be coming to Washington to visit President Biden at the White House soon. It's been about 6 months since President Biden and former Prime Minister Suga met and announced the so-called core partnership, the Competitiveness and Resilience partnership. And so, we're interested in sort of getting an update on that. It's been over 2 years since the U.S. and Japan negotiated two bilateral trade agreements, one general trade agreement and one on digital trade. So getting an update on that is important. And then next week, there's going to be a flurry of travel by American officials to, actually this week and next week, we've had the Assistant Secretary of State, Dan Crittenbrink, has been in Tokyo this week. Next week, U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo are going to be in Tokyo. So there's a lot of action, including on trade and economic issues. And I understand there may be a congressional delegation there as well. So, so this kind of highlights two essential points about Japan. One, it is a critical ally of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. And secondly, it's the third largest economy in the world and a critical economic player for the United States. Japan's economic weight makes it a large market for U.S. exporters, a large source of supply for a lot of products from consumer to industrial products, but also critical technologies. Your cell phone probably has quite a lot of Japanese components in it. So it's a critical economic and commercial relationship. We've obviously had a long history of somewhat fraught bilateral economic relations. Certainly, many of the people on this call have dealt with some of those issues over many years. And we still have our differences, and we're going to talk about some of those today. But overall, the relationship is a lot better, so we can be sort of more focused on those particular concerns. It's really striking to me how aligned we've become on, notwithstanding the challenges and problems, we've been really become quite aligned on economic rules and norms. That's important to our bilateral relationship, but also in our work together in the Indo-Pacific region and in the world in trying to update and uphold those economic rules and norms. And that's another dimension of the U.S.-Japan relationship that we want to talk about here this morning. So there's quite a lot to cover. And we don't have a lot of time, but a lot of great expertise here. And so I think with that, I'm going to bring in our terrific panel here. We've got pretty much the all-star cast of who you would want if you want to talk about these issues. First of all, everybody I think knows Wendy Cutler, who is Vice President and Managing Director of the DC office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's former acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative and probably has done more negotiating with Japan than anybody alive today. So she is the real pro here on these issues. We've also got Charles Freeman with us today. Charles is Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He is a China hand himself, but he covers Japan as part of his role and knows a lot about the bilateral relationship. So Charles is a former assistant USTR for China and Mongolia, I think, as I recall. And then we've got Robert Holloman, who again is, I think, well known to this group. He was deputy USTR in the Obama administration. He's now president and CEO of Kroll and Mooring International, and a good friend and someone who you'll see has terrific insights on the issues we're discussing this morning. And last but definitely not least is Noriyuki Shikata, who gets the award for staying up the latest here. It's very late in Japan, and we very much appreciate Shikata-san's joining us late at night, especially with the time change. It's been even later than we originally planned. He is Cabinet Secretary for Public Affairs in the new Kishida administration. He was, just before this, the Assistant Minister and Director General for the Economic Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo. So he's very knowledgeable about economic matters generally and about the U.S. Japan economic relationship. Okay, so we're going to do a couple of rounds of questions among this group, and then I am going to invite the audience to submit questions. You should have a Q&A button on your screen, and if you press that, you'll be able to offer a question, and I will try to get to as many of those as I can after we talk to the panel. So with that, I'm going to start with Wendy. Wendy, let's start with the bilateral trade issues. So, just give us a general characterization of the relationship or of trade relations. What's working well? Where do we still have challenges and need to do more work? And sort of, do either the 2019 trade agreements or the core partnership, form the basis for taking forward some of those both opportunities and also challenges in the relationship?
Well, first, thank you. It's my pleasure to be on a panel with a lot of old friends and really experts in the field, and a special shout out to my friend from Japan, Nori Shikata, who's done a lot through his career promoting stronger U.S. Japan economic ties. So where are we now? I think we're like in a really good spot with Japan on trade. And if you had asked me that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I would not only have not said that, but I would have told you that I wouldn't have thought I could ever say that. Things have just improved dramatically. We have, I think our trade relationship is over $250 billion of goods and services back and forth between our two countries. And for the most part, a lot of the bilateral irritants have been solved in our relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still trade problems and certain sectors and certain companies that are experiencing problems in Japan. But I think that's only natural in a trading relationship that's so large. So when I'm asked whether we should, put emphasis on the so-called next phase of a bilateral trade negotiation moving towards an FTA, my view is I don't think we need to do that. That's not where we should be spending our resources now. I think when I look at the trade challenges that face the region and the world, that the most effective route and the most meaningful way to work with Japan is trying jointly to address those challenges hand in glove together. And I will be the first to admit that 10, 20, 30 years ago, Japan always wanted to, have dialogues about what we should do on regional and global issues. We always thought this was just their attempt to divert attention from the festering bilateral problems. But today, I think that, again, the most useful thing we can do is to be working together to address regional and global issues. So why don't I stop there? And
let me just ask.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wendy. And let me just dig down on one issue that is in contention right now, which is steel. The Section 232 case on steel, the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on a number of allies, including Japan. There was just a resolution with Europe, at least for now, of that issue, but not yet an agreement with Japan. Is that something that you think might be resolved soon, including maybe even next week when USTR Tai is there?
Well, I hope so, because in my view, now that we've reached a deal with the EU, it's time to work with our other allies and partners and find a solution with them as well. I expect that during both Secretary Raimondo and Ambassador Tai's visit, this will be high in the agenda for our Japanese colleagues. And I think politically for them, it's very important for them to be able to show domestically that they are as strong allies to the United States, that the United States is offering them either the same or similar deal that was just concluded with the European Union. That said, I mean, I'm urging my Japanese colleagues to be realistic. I don't think a deal can be reached next week, but I do think that both sides can enter into negotiations towards a deal to be reached in the near future.
Okay, that's helpful. Others may want to weigh in on that in a minute, but let me ask Shikata-san to jump in if he will. And really same question, sort of how would you characterize the U.S.-Japan economic relationship today and the trade relationship? How are we doing and where are the main opportunities or challenges?
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for your kind invitation to this excellent panel discussion. On your question, I pretty much agreed to Wendy's observations of the current state of affairs between the United States and Japan in terms of economic relations. The major factor for this change over the last 25 years or so is that so many Japanese companies invested in the United States and created jobs for American workers. And during the pandemic, COVID-19, many Japanese companies were producing, for example, medical equipment for local communities, face shields and others. So in terms of the economic relations between the US and Japan, we are in good shape. Among US trade deficits, Japan's share of US trade deficit in goods is about 6%, in contrast to China's, which is over 34%. But there are issues that we need to tackle, including the steel and aluminum tariffs, as Section 232 issues. And given the new development between the US and the EU, we certainly, hope, that we will be reaching a constructive outcome on this issue between Japan and the United States. And on the issue of Japan-US trade agreements, 2 years ago, Minister Motegi was negotiating bilateral trade agreements with Ambassador Lighthizer. And this was in response to President Trump's decision to withdraw, from TPP. So, of course, these bilateral agreements have been implemented very smoothly, I think. But of course, there is a strong hope on the side of Japan that we wish to see the US returning to TPP or CPTPP, especially when we are seeing new applicants in the context of expansion of CPTPP, including the UK, China, Taiwan, among others. So for us, it is critically important to promote U.S.-Japan partnership in the context of free and open Indo-Pacific. And this is something for Prime Minister Kishida wishes to deepen ties with the United States, President Biden, in the economic arenas, including in the context of the Quad and FOIP, among others. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I want to come back to some of those issues you raised in the sort of regional context about TPP and some of those organizations like the Quad. But let me just ask you a follow-up quickly. Wendy said that she didn't think that we should be focusing the U.S. and Japan our energies on negotiating a kind of further onward bilateral agreement, a phase 2 agreement or something. Do you agree with that? Is that something that Tokyo thinks there was, back when the 2019 agreement was announced, I went back and looked at the White House fact sheet, and it actually anticipated, it said very kind of specifically that there would be a phase 2. I didn't say phase 2, but it said there would be a continuing negotiation. Is that, from your view, no longer kind of an important objective?
Well, as you know, at this point of time, we are not negotiating, phase 2 between the U.S. and Japan in the context of trade agreements, and this is in light of the start of Kishida administration. I'm sure that Prime Minister Kishida wishes to explore new opportunities for deeper collaboration between Japan and the United States. And so this is something we wish to discuss with the American counterparts. And my personal view is that we are very much interested in engaging the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, especially in the area of economic and trade and possibly digital areas, in addition to existing security cooperation.
And just to be clear, is the Kishida administration still sort of committed to the core partnership that was negotiated by former Prime Minister Suga with, or announced by former Prime Minister Suga with President Biden in April, or does he want to establish a new kind of partnership on the issues you just mentioned?
My view is that this is going to continue. Core partnership is something which resonates very well with Prime Minister Kishida's agenda items under the discussion of realizing new capitalism, which already includes issues like green growth and clean energy, as well as introduction of digital technologies in Japan and beyond. So I'm sure that there will be lots of opportunities for Japan and the United States, including private companies, to cooperate not only bilaterally, but in other Asian countries. For example, promoting renewable energy in Asian economies, including ASEAN countries or India, would be very suitable areas for cooperation between Kishida administration and Biden administration.
Okay, that's helpful. And I also want to come back on the, if we have time, on the new form of capitalism initiative of Mr. Kishida, which sort of echoes in a way some of the things that the Biden administration seems to be doing domestically, which is interesting. But let me pull Charles in now. And Charles, you know, and I think we're involved in some of these efforts over the years, that U.S. companies across a wide range of sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, services, for many years used to spend a lot of time and energy pushing for greater market access in Japan, or frankly, even though you wouldn't put it this way, seeking protection from Japanese imports into the United States. I don't want to get distracted on that issue. I'm just comparing the days when you used to see a lot of kind of vocal action and interest in pushing on market access in Japan. It seems as though it's not quite as there's not quite as much energy, or at least noise, about those issues. But there are issues still, and American business still is interested in that market and wants to address some of the remaining obstacles to success over there. So can you talk a little bit about that sort of current state of play and how it relates to the past?
Sure. Well, thanks, Matthew. It's it's first of all, it's terrific to be on a panel with my old running buddy Wendy Cutler and as well as Robert and Shikata-san. I think that's true that there has not been as much there has not been as much kind of axe grinding as there has been in the past on market access or other things with respect to U.S. entry into Japan. But part of that is because of the success of U.S. companies in Japan. I mean, for a number of companies, U.S. companies, Japan is is a top 3 international market, and that's appropriate. This is, as you say, the 3rd largest economy in the world, and for all intents and purposes, that the relationship should be much bigger than it actually is. I mean, you have I forget the numbers. It's as $680 billion in Japanese FDI in the U.S., but only 130 billion of U.S. FDI in Japan, which is provides 400,000 jobs or so, but is probably underweight where it could be, from where it could be. So there are steps that we can move forward on, and as was mentioned earlier, in an ideal world, we would have a comprehensive free trade agreement the way that the UK or the EU does with Japan. It doesn't make a ton of sense to us in the business community that we have one of the closest alliances and partnerships of any bilateral relationship, and yet we don't have a comprehensive partnership on the econ side, and that there are a number of things that are missing from a relationship as a result of not having that comprehensive FTA, and so there are things to work on. And so while certainly we understand that phase 2 may be the product of a previous administration, and there isn't much enthusiasm for negotiating that within the Biden administration, or frankly within the Japanese government. It's really something that's a real shame. And the core is a great initiative, and we think highly of it, but quite honestly, it's not the kind of in-depth, very intricate kind of negotiation that you'd have that would really, in our view, solve some serious problems in the relationship. So, with respect to those on the panel and others who went through the extensive bilateral and conversations in the 90s about some of these, I think it's important that we get back to having much deeper conversations about as Secretary Raimondo says, the investment and trade relationship, particularly in areas like digital and innovative economy and healthcare. So there's a lot that we could be doing, and we're just not, for any number of reasons that I think we understand, but still continues to be frustrating.
You just touched on something I want to be sure that I understand and viewers understand. When I think people who have a sort of general knowledge of the trade relationship with Japan think about the market access issues, I think they know about the agriculture interests and our interest in that market, and a lot of which was addressed in the 2019 agreement. But can you name a couple of other sectors, areas where the U.S. has particular interests in that market?
Well, I mean, obviously, life sciences for any number of reasons. It's an important market for U.S. companies, and we've seen some regulatory backsliding on things like pricing certainty and the rest of it for U.S. companies that, for whom Japan is such an important market. And there are other areas of emerging technologies, whether it's 5G, AI, and others, where there are not the rules of the road, and that we could be applying. And even the 2019 digital agreement, as good as it is starting to get show signs of age, because the digital environment is so dynamic and moves so quickly. So we've got to have these kind of living agreements, and if we're not going to do a comprehensive one, well, let's focus on the areas that show the most promise and need the most direct attention right now.
Okay, great. Let me, that's a good segue into Robert, because I wanted to ask you about the digital agreement, the 2019 bilateral digital trade agreement. But actually, I want to offer you a broader chance to talk about the relationship, because I've asked everybody else that, sort of how you see that, and whether they're, kind of the state of play as described by others is how you see it. And then I'd welcome your thoughts on the 2019 agreement.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Matt. And it's always a pleasure to be part of a discussion with you, with this panel, and with CSIS. So thank you for the invitation. I broadly agree with the comments that are on this panel. I certainly had been optimistic that we could, during the Trump administration, reach a broader agreement with Japan on trade. I think that would have fulfilled what we were trying to do, and Wendy was helping lead very much when we were in the Obama administration. And so I think there's some opportunities that really could be solidified by having a broader agreement. But I also agree that that's not really in the cards right now. And so I think we need to focus on what we can do together. And I think the digital agreement is a great example, but it's also an example with its flaws. So it's a great example because the US and Japan are both leaders in the digital economy. We share many of the common values, and we share the broad view that we need trade agreements that lay out a positive path for the digital economy that has as few barriers as possible, while respecting the need for governments to regulate on issues like privacy, and also to ensure the free flow of data with trust, to use the former Prime Minister's phrase. The 2019 digital agreement between the US and Japan sought to build on those principles, but it was also a substitute, and I would say a flawed substitute, to the US departure from the TPP, or what became the CPTPP. And so that agreement added some provisions that were necessary from when we negotiated TPP, but it's ultimately not binding. It's more of a kind of statement of principles where we share. And I think it was more a political statement, a valuable political statement, but more a political statement than it was something that had real meaning as between those two economies. What I think we see on digital is that Japan is really the strongest ally, and certainly as the third largest economy in the world, that is both a partner of the US on trade and a national security ally, but they are in the room in places where the US is no longer in the room, specifically around the CPTP provisions around data, the RCEP, which they're in, which has weaker provisions on data. They're also in the room, but they have a voice that candidly the US does not have, because we're not part of some of these agreements. And so I think there's a real opportunity for the US through this shared partnership to help encourage Japan to use their voice and to support their voice on things like the data provisions in the CPTPP, particularly with countries like Vietnam, which have not met the full obligations that they should be meeting under the CPTP digital provisions. Happy to elaborate more on it, but I think the partnership really goes beyond bilateral, and it extends into these regional agreements on both trade as well as, of course, national security.
Perfect. Okay, that's a great segue into the sort of shift from the pure bilateral to the regional, and you've already kind of anticipated a question I have for everybody, which is the kind of elephant in the room about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or its follow-on agreement, the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership for Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. So Japan, just for the sake of the audience to remind, Japan sort of salvaged that trade agreement after the United States pulled out in 2017. And continued it through this sort of similar agreement, CPTPP, and with the other 11 members of the group. And now, just recently, you've had a lot of interest from other economies in joining, the UK, Taiwan, and of course, China has now applied for membership in CPTPP. Yet the Biden administration is still signaling disinterest in joining that agreement or rejoining some new variation on TPP. Maybe we're all going to be surprised in the next couple of days as President Biden gives a speech at APEC, or at least has conversations with other leaders at APEC about economic and trade engagement in the region, and with the two secretaries, as I mentioned, or cabinet level officials visiting Tokyo next week. Maybe we'll get some sort of surprise announcement, but I wouldn't hold my breath. So with that sort of preface, I'd be interested in everybody's sort of thoughts about where we are on regional trade and how the U.S. and Japan can move an agenda forward without the likelihood of the United States being part of CPTPP in the short term. So Wendy, sort of first with you, kind of how do you look at that, and what can the U.S. and Japan do to get that moving forward, that agenda?
Well, we're already doing a lot through the Quad, through the G7, and other coalitions of countries coming together, and having Japan with us on a lot of the initiatives and ideas that we're interested in is really gives a lot more weight to what we're putting forward, whether it be on infrastructure, on technologies, on clean energy, or even on the pandemic response. All of these areas are just critical right now, regionally and globally, and U.S.-Japan partnership is really important. One area where I think that the U.S. and Japan perhaps can do more work is in the area of trying to develop rules on industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. And I was really taken by Xi Jinping's comment last week at the Shanghai Expo, when he said that now China is open to negotiating on these very issues. And I think he even mentioned digital. And even though perhaps these comments were made in the context of China's interest in the CPTPP, I think the time is right for the US, Japan, and perhaps the EU to finish the great trilateral work that was undertaken during the Trump administration, and kind of test this out with China. If China is really interested and open, and this comes from Xi Jinping, to negotiations in this area, why not take this trilateral work over the finish line and test this proposition with China? I think that's just a ripe area for cooperation. The other just point I put on the table when I think of the upcoming visits of Ambassador Tai, as well as Secretary Raimondo, having worked for a number of administrations, particularly in the early days, there's always this temptation to announce new initiatives and new frameworks. And given that we've already announced the core agreement with Japan during Prime Minister Suga's visit to Washington, What I'm not seeing is a lot of follow-up on these announcements and initiatives. So I think it's important not to just keep repackaging the same issues that we want to work with Japan on, including supply chains, green technology, infrastructure, and so on, and just giving them a new name, but really showing results and showing what we can do in each of these areas, and focus more on the substance and less on kind of the packaging. I know for political leaders, this is always difficult to do. But again, I think this work on subsidies and state-owned enterprises, I think this is just so ripe right now to try and push this forward.
Yeah, terrific. I'm glad you raised that because, I mean, for a couple of reasons. The reason you stated, which is it's a really important issue and a problem for the rest of the world, as China does these sort of massive subsidies and industrial policies that create overcapacity and real economic challenges for the rest of the world. And it was something the Trump administration actually did work with Japan and Europe on. And you know, there's been hints of a 301 case or something that would take this forward here. But I think, you know, working with Japan and Europe on those issues would be really important. So that's an important reason for raising it. The other that I've heard you say before, and I won't put words in your mouth, I'll say it in my own words, that, you know, the fact that China is signaling these things as part of its application to join CPTPP, that they're willing to sort of move closer to the CPP standard on SOEs, you know, I think should be taken seriously. You know, I think we tend to dismiss these things as just a mischief or not really serious, but I do think I've heard you say this before, and I believe it myself, that we have to look at these developments seriously and not just think complacently China is never going to be able to meet that standard. So I'm glad you raised the issue. I'm interested if others want to, you know, comment on that. But let me ask Shikata-san about this. You know, how do we take forward a credible sort of regional trade strategy, you know, with the U.S. not in CPTPP, presuming, you know, that's not going to happen in the near term? What can the U.S. and Japan do? And if I can just slip in one of the questions that's come in from the audience from our good friend Kurt Tong, who asked a very specific question of Shikata-san, which is, what is Japan's stance on the ROK, on the Republic of Korea joining CPTPP? That's a sub question to the question for you, Shikata-san.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I pretty much agree to, you know, what Wendy mentioned, and these issues as related to industrial subsidies and SOEs are very important agenda items. And these are the issues that we have been discussing in the context of trilateral. And also more recently, this year's UK presidency of G7, these issues have been discussed among G7 trade ministers. In response to China's application to CPTPP, we have specifically mentioned some chapters, high standard chapters, such as e-commerce, intellectual property right, government procurement, SOEs, among others. So we wish to know, you know, how China could meet the TPP standards in these chapters. And of course, you know, those applicants that resort to economic coercion, can they be eligible, you know, for TPP membership? You know, I'm talking about general terms. You know, because we are talking about high standards, those TPP applicants need to abide by international law, WTO rules, WTO plus TPP, you know, rules. And on the question of ROK, I don't think, you know, ROK has made up its mind, you know, to apply for CPTPP. So it's kind of premature for us to discuss, you know, how we would respond, you know, to these applications. What we said on the record as related to Taiwan's application is that we share basic values with Taiwan, and we maintain close economic ties. So we welcome Taiwan's application itself. So, and just one more issue. Robert was talking about data, and we wish to cooperate with the United States on DFFT. And DFFT is something Prime Minister Kishida has been mentioning.
Data free flow with trust, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, and so this is something, based on common values. We wish to come up with the international rulemaking. This could eventually be in the context of WTO e-commerce negotiations, but also we have been engaging the EU on this issue in terms of data free flow, in terms of revising existing Japan-EU EPA. We are at the kind of preparatory stage on this.
Okay, well, you can see Shikata-san is a good diplomat because he has, if you listen carefully, he's answered a question that I was going to ask about Japan's view of China's application, Taiwan's application, and the separate question from Kurt Tong about Korea, but you had to listen carefully to get exactly what the Japanese position is, but it was there, I think. So Charles, let me ask you as a China hand, first of all, interested in your thoughts about the discussion we've just been having and about China and Taiwan's applications to CPTPP, how serious they are, how they're likely to proceed, and on the subsidies question as well. And then I have a sort of, I'll just throw it in now, and I could ask it separately, but let me just get you starting to think about it, which is, from a U.S. business perspective, how big a problem is it that the U.S. is not signaling an interest in rejoining something like TPP?
Well, in answer to your last question, it's a problem for U.S. business, but I think we've kind of baked it into our plans for the foreseeable future, simply because the Biden administration has been pretty categorical in saying they would not rejoin, particularly given the political calendar. So that that's a shame, but that's why we say, okay, well, let's pivot and look at other opportunities, whether that's on the digital side or otherwise. On China and Taiwan and the CPTPP, I think it is tempting for those of us that look at China's economic system and the evolution of its state-directed approach to its economy, and sort of chuckle that they could actually meet the terms of CPTPP, particularly as Shikata-san said on SOEs and otherwise. But you talk to the Singaporeans or others, and I think we need to be careful in the United States about being too sanguine that China is that this is simply some sort of economic statecraft approach by China rather than something that's legitimately possible. And I agree with Wendy, as always, that in some respects, have at it. If the CPTPP countries are going to hold China's feet to the fire, then absolutely, if they can qualify, I think that's good for American business too. Taiwan, it should have no problem qualifying for CPTPP. Of course, Taiwan's domestic protective industries, including agriculture, are pretty vibrant, I guess is the word, or violent, depending on your perspective. And so I'm not sure it's a slam dunk. If it were a slam dunk, I think Taiwan would have been farther along in terms of the bilateral U.S. Taiwan relationship and on the trade front. So.
Okay, Robert, you already have talked a little about the digital economy story in the regional context, but just a lot of people have been talking about this as another pathway for the United States to get back in the game in regional rulemaking by negotiating some kind of digital something, a trade agreement or some other arrangement. As you know, I've sort of touted the notion of, or I did tout the notion of the U.S. joining the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, this little agreement that Singapore and New Zealand and Chile have negotiated that would be a great thing for the U.S. to dock onto. The reason I'm slightly now, I've come to sort of pause on that is that China has now applied to join that as well. And while that again seems like on one level mischief on their part, because it doesn't seem like they're ready to accept those, the sort of the approach or the philosophy of that effort, it's thrown, I think, another kind of spanner in the works, as my British father used to say here. So sorry, I got off track on that thing, but just why yet the Biden administration still does not seem to have latched onto any of these digital arrangements, and USTR tie sort of, again, didn't give us any real sense that we were moving towards that. Why is this so difficult, and what's the promise of it if we did embrace it?
Well, let me say, I think what the promise of it is that, as Shikata-san said, we have some shared common values, including around things like data-free flow with trust. And if we're only talking about our shared values and not in any way committing to those, or not trying to expand the adoption of those shared values, then we're losing ground. So I think the U.S. has an obligation to be there to do that. And the fact that we are not moving is problematic. There's also the remaining challenge, though, which is just like the U.S. Japan digital agreement, just like the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which I too thought the U.S. should strive to become part of, and I think we still should. They're not binding in the way that a traditional trade agreement is. They don't have the sort of dispute settlements. They don't have the penalties that come for not adhering to them, but they're better than nothing. And right now, we don't have something that we're for, where we're working collectively to try to advance the ball. On the CPTPP in China, I'll just note that, what I hope we see in their application is that as negotiations occur, that China is in fact held to the highest standards of the CPTPP. And I would look at the digital chapter as a perfect example of that. They need to be not given periods of time to adjust. They need to be to make the kind of changes in their domestic law and policy that would be necessary, as well as around state-owned enterprises and otherwise. And so I think the gap between where China is now and what they would need to do to meet the spirit and the tone and the text of the CPTPP is pretty substantial. And again, I use Vietnam as the example on that. I'm delighted that Vietnam is part of the CPTPP. They were a critical part for the US equation when we were moving forward. But Vietnam got certain sort of free ride on issues around digital for at least a transition period of time. And in that time, Vietnam has taken some steps that are really not only contrary to the spirit, but to the text of the CPTPP. So I hope that when that transition period ends, that Japan and other CPTPP economies will move forward to secure the kind of changes that need to take place in Japan. And at the same time, they need to ensure that China does not get the same sort of free pass that Vietnam has, because were that to happen, it would be a compounding effect that would really gut some of the most important principles of the CPTPP. So I think that's the opportunity. I think it's the challenge. And I do think the US has to find some way to get back into the game.
Okay, well said. So I'm going to take a couple more audience questions now. And there are a couple of questions that sort of relate to a topic that I was hoping to bring into the conversation, but we didn't have a lot of time on sort of broadly defined economic security. That's a term that is now being used in Japan. There's even a minister for economic security. And so Shikata-san, I want to hear a little more about that development in Japan and what that means and what the focus of energy is going to be and how the US and Japan may work in that space. And there's a specific question about whether the US and Japan are going to be working together on supply chain issues and where that stands. I mean, they are based on the core partnership. That was a core element of working together on critical supply chain issues. Semiconductors, biotechnology, 5G, AI, other things are mentioned in the core partnership. And since this question seems to be from our friend Ben Squires at Howmet Aerospace, also a supporter of CSIS, appreciate that. And this is not a planted question, but he asked about other critical materials that the US and Japan may work together on, like titanium sponge. How is, which was the target of a 232 investigation in the Trump administration, how is this conversation about economic security broadly and specifically on working together on critical supply chains, how is that moving forward?
Well, thank you very much. As you mentioned, Prime Minister Kishida appointed a new minister, Minister Kobayashi, who is in charge of economic security. And I think, this economic security discussion will make progress in Japan, including introducing possible new bills and so forth, coming up with a new policy framework. And of course, these issues include semiconductor or supply chain issues with the possibility of deepening our cooperation with the United States. And also we used to make best use of emerging frameworks such as the Quad. So this is not only about the Japanese domestic economic policy, but it has a wider international collaboration issues. And for us, I believe our cooperation with the United States is so important. And we are hoping, that between Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden, this will be deepened, and this is in line with existing core partnership. So, and Mr. Kishida has also been talking about AI or quantum computing, among other high technology research projects, and this is a very suitable area for U.S. Japan cooperation.
Okay, terrific. There are also some questions coming in about decoupling with China and sort of how that affects the US and Japan dynamic. So anybody can take this on, but there's a specific question about whether, transferring production from China to India is a thing that will or should happen, and how can Japan and the US sort of encourage that or get involved in that? And maybe Charles, sort of more broadly, on this decoupling question, as a China hand, again, interested in your thoughts generally on that story, but specifically on these efforts to try to encourage shifts of production out of China to other places. How do you or the business community think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, shifting production or sourcing out of China has been kind of an obsession, not just for Tokyo and DC, but to our membership as well, and finding ways to make supply chains more resilient by shifting production to Southeast Asia or Latin America is something that everybody would like to achieve, or India. But that's easier said than done, in large part because producing in China continues to deliver the kind of economies of scale and efficiencies that you don't get in other markets, and candidly, the policy environments in those markets are, including India, are just not up to delivering the kind of certainty and investment that our members would like to see. So yeah, I mean, there are any number of challenges with moving production outside, but I think we need to remember that the vast majority of U.S. trade with China is not either a security risk or a supply chain issue. The vast majority continues to be to serve the interests of the United States, including our middle class and workers. But we tend to forget that in sometimes. But the moving production out of China completely is really is something, if you actually break down the costs of moving production, they're extraordinary. So the key for us is I think the business community with respect to Japan is finding ways to collaborate on innovative policies, whether it's in the digital world or in life sciences or otherwise. And I think that's the key, is developing kind of those new collaborative programs that the private sector can really sink its teeth into.
Okay, got it. I think maybe Wendy and possibly Robert also wanted to say something maybe about the supply chain issues or decoupling. Wendy, did you want to offer something? I'm interested because you've got an interesting tracker of supply chain movements, and so I'm happy to tout that.
So just briefly, and actually I wasn't going to do that, but thank you, Matt, you're such a gentleman. At the Asia Society, we have put forward a digital tool which actually tracks the investment policies of countries in the Indo-Pacific region that are trying to attract these shifting supply chains. So I urge you to go onto our website and to check it out. What I just wanted to make the point on supply chains, and this kind of ties in with an earlier comment I made. There's always a temptation to announce new dialogues, a new public-private partnership on supply chains. I just want to put forward the idea, why don't we work with Japan as kind of a model agreement, bring in other countries on what an actual trusted supply chain agreement would look like in one sector. So not just have meetings to discuss all of this, but actually put down what would the principles be? What would the obligations be? I mean, you can start kind of light, that they would focus on transparency, consultation, particularly in times of shortages, maybe even look at exploring co-production, but there's just, more that can be done here. And this just kind of gets to my comment that, for initiatives to be credible and meaningful, they need to have follow through and they need to produce results and outcomes. And again, I think now in the Biden administration, we're just seeing so many new initiatives being announced touching upon all of these issues. But when you actually ask what's going on with the other countries in these areas, it's still early, but I think there needs to be more follow through and more focus on outcomes.
I totally agree. And I mean, although I also agree with your point that it is early, and I sort of always say, give them a little more time to get all the sort of ducks in a row and be able to implement on some of these things. But that said, I agree with you that there've been a lot of different packages and frameworks announced. And one of them that was asked about by somebody, we're not going to have time to really take this on, but Tanaka-san from Kyoto News has asked about the President Biden's announcement during the ASEAN summits of a new Indo-Pacific economic framework. It's got a lot of a sort of grab bag of issues, some of which we've been talking about, but what exactly is there? What is actually going to happen in that agreement is I think a question we all have. So that's my attempt to sort of start to answer that question. We'll have to do another event on that. Robert, did you want to say something about the supply chain?
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the question of, could supply chain move to places like India, for example. Ambassador Tai, after she goes to Tokyo, she'll be moving on to New Delhi for the U.S.-India Trade Policy Forum. Having led negotiations for the U.S. with India, I could say I'm sure both the U.S. and Japan would like India to be a more reliable trade partner. We certainly have some good examples in the life sciences industries of where they are, but there are still so many hurdles that need to be accomplished. And those are really things that India could agree to open up, but to date they have not been. And so I think there's an interest in the US, India bilaterally, as well as through the Quad and others to press India to open up, become a more reliable partner. But to date, there's still some substantial challenges that make it hard for many companies to do the kind of business there they would like to do in the future.
Great. We're just about at time, but I wanted to give Shikata-san, if he had anything he wanted to add on any of the above, a chance to.
Sure. Just briefly. So there are some Japanese companies relocating their investments from China to some of the ASEAN countries, such as Vietnam or Thailand. And given the increasing labor cost in China, there are corporate judgments, and also business environment in China these days are not as good as they used to be. In the meantime, there is a growing opportunity for US and Japan to cooperate in ASEAN countries or India. And what we are trying to do between Japan and the US in the context of vaccine production in India is a good case in point. And of course, we have been working on Shinkansen, bullet train projects in India during the last 15 years. And this is good for the environment, and this will facilitate the improvement of business environment in India. So there are tremendous opportunities for us to collaborate.
Well, great. Look, there are so many of other things we need to discuss. We didn't really get into depth about clean energy and climate change related issues on which there's a lot of opportunity, although Shikata-san just touched on another dimension of that. There have been questions about domestic challenges in Japan, economic challenges, and some of the policies that are being taken there. I mentioned the new form of capitalism and the sort of wealth redistribution policy objectives of the Kishida administration. There's also been, starting in the Suga administration, a focus on digitization of the Japanese economy. A lot of issues around new industries, life sciences, and others that have been touched on. That I think we would need another event for each one of these topics, and we will do that. But for now, let me just thank this terrific panel of friends, and really they all are friends, and experts on this subject matter for their time and insights. We really appreciate that. Thank you. We'll have you all back. And thank you to the audience, especially the audience in Japan. It's quite late there now. Thank you, Shikata-san, for staying up with us. But to be continued, we will continue to, all of us, each of us, continue to think about and work on these issues, and hope to stay in touch with everyone. So thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.